part of me. Well, I'm not selling shit. No, I'm not selling shit.
Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining me. It's taken me a little longer than I expected to get this ready for you. That's partly because I probably tried to be a little bit too fancy and ran into some technical difficulties. But I've learned a few things, and I'm glad I finally have the chance to present it to you. What I'm going to present to you is a little bit longer than what I had originally intended to present in class. At the same time, it's only going to scratch the surface on a lot of the things we're talking about. So think about it more as an introduction to a bunch of different topics rather than an in-depth argument or analysis of a whole lot of things. I've broken it down into 4 parts. So this is part 1, where we're going to do an introduction and talk about some of the theory. In part 2, we'll talk about celebrities. In part 3, we'll talk about dating apps. And in part 4, we'll talk about university classrooms. Now, the title of the lecture is Sell Yourself, Neoliberalism and the Value of the Personal. And I want to start by sort of breaking down that subtitle, starting with the personal. Now, the Oxford English Dictionary has several different definitions of the word personal, but the one I'm most interested in is of or concerning one's private life, relationships, and emotions rather than one's career or public life. So the Oxford English Dictionary sets up a dichotomy to define the personal. On one side, you have the personal, the private, emotions, and relationships, while on the other side, you have the public and your career. Now, the public and the private have never been quite that separate. There's always been holes in the barrier that separates them. But my argument today is that the dichotomy that the Oxford English Dictionary sets up collapses in a very particular way under neoliberalism. Your relationship and your career no longer seem that separate or even all that different. And the personal not only becomes public, it becomes a way you can market and sell yourself. This raises the question, what exactly is neoliberalism? And that's a difficult question to answer, because a lot of scholars use the term in very different ways. Some, for example, use it to refer to specific economic policies that favor the free market and limit regulation. I'm going to use Michel Foucault's definition of neoliberalism, specifically American neoliberalism. He suggests that American neoliberalism came from the quest to properly understand and evaluate labor. In the traditional understanding of how to evaluate labor, there was no differentiation between the people doing the work. If you had one person working for a full day, she might produce a certain amount. If you had 3 people, they would produce 3 times that amount, and if you had 5 people, they would produce 5 times that amount. Of course, that's not quite how it works. 3 different people who work the same amount of time with the same limited resources will produce different amounts. In the 1960s, the members of the Chicago School of Economics set about to figure out why one worker can produce more than another even when they both have the same limited resources. And leading the charge was Gary Becker. For example, in a 1960 paper called An Economic Analysis of Fertility, Becker determines that the amount of time parents spend with their children, the quality of education and medical care that children receive, and the diversity of cultural production that children are exposed to has a direct relationship to the quality of children. Furthermore, the number of children a family has, combined with the amount of money parents have to spend on their children, impacts the ability of parents to provide those things for their children. As he bluntly states at one point in the paper, the rich simply choose higher quality children, as well as higher quality of other goods. In the paper, he explains what he means by quality children. I will call more expensive children higher quality children, just as Cadillacs are called higher quality cars than Chevrolets. To avoid any misunderstanding, let me hasten to add that higher quality does not mean morally better. If more is voluntarily spent on one child than on another, it is because the parents obtain additional utility from the additional expenditure, and it is this additional utility which we call higher quality. Later in the paper, he explains that the quality of children is very important in its own right, for it determines the education, health, and motivation of the future labor force. Essentially, Becker is arguing that the more money parents have to spend on their children, the better workers they will turn out to be when they grow up. This is partly what leads Foucault to say that under neoliberalism, it must be possible to analyze the simple time parents spend feeding their children or giving them affection as an investment which can form human capital. Human capital is the combination of education, experience, wisdom, emotional competence, etc. Gary Becker helped popularize the term in part through his book called Human Capital. According to Becker, quality children gain more human capital, which enables them to become more successful workers. But Becker pushed things a bit further. He didn't just want to understand why some people are better workers than others. He wanted to understand why some people are more satisfied with their lives than others. And he figured those two things were related. After all, if human capital can help you decide the best way to use limited resources at work, why couldn't it help you to do the same with the limited resources of money, time, energy, and affection outside of work? In other words, the same qualities that make you a more productive worker make you a happier person. Or maybe it shouldn't look more like this. Becker began looking at all sorts of personal decisions and evaluated them in the same way one might involve a business decision. For example, in a paper called A Theory of Marriage, he plainly states that economic theory may well be on its way to providing a unified framework for all behavior involving scarce resources. He includes romantic relationships, specifically marriage, in this kind of behavior. Men and women compete as they seek mates in a market in marriages. Each person tries to find the best mate, subject to the restrictions imposed by market conditions. Becker suggests that people marry in order to raise their utility level above what it would be were they to remain single. He uses a complex formula to determine the value of qualities of potential mates, including earning power, IQ, education, height, attractiveness, skin color, ethnic origin, and other characteristics. He even tries to determine the relative value of caring, which he puts in scare quotes. At the end of the paper is a mathematical appendix where he shows how he calculated the value of these attributes. For Becker, finding a romantic partner for marriage is part of a larger task of improving your satisfaction. And since the task of improving satisfaction, or becoming happier, is a series of decisions involving scarce resources, he determined that the best way to approach these decisions incorporates economic theory. In other words, approach your life and your happiness like a business. Foucault argues that people become entrepreneurs of themselves, producing their own satisfaction. He makes these arguments in the late 70s, and he's largely predicting what might happen if we take Becker's theories to their logical conclusion. Contemporary scholars have returned to Foucault's predictions and argue that much of what he anticipated has come true. For example, Elena Gershon argues that neoliberalism has had a dramatic impact on the way we interact with each other. People understand themselves as a collection of skills or traits that can enter into alliances with other such collections. Every relationship is a business partnership. There are some scholars who suggest that things have developed in ways that Foucault did not anticipate. For example, Michel Fayer argues that the contemporary economy is built around investment and appreciation of investment, rather than a direct exchange of goods and services. He goes on to suggest that this is a model of how neoliberalism impacts the way people see themselves and how they interact with others. He says, our main purpose is not so much to profit from our accumulated potential as to constantly value or appreciate ourselves, or at least prevent our own depreciation. Part of the way we do that is investing in our human capital, either through the things we do for ourselves, like yoga classes or reading groups, learning a new language, etc., or through the kinds of relationships that we foster. Of course, you are not just an investor. You are also a commodity that other people invest in. So part of the way you interact with people under neoliberalism is to market yourself as a good investment, whether it be for employment or a personal relationship. To do that, You accentuate the qualities you have that other people might be attracted to. Something about you and your human capital that will help others raise the value of their human capital and their potential for satisfaction. You read the market and adjust not only what you do, but how you present yourself in order to gain an advantage in the market and attract more or better investors. To gain a better understanding of how this works, we'll turn to a more hyperbolic example in part 2, celebrities.
You got to accentuate the positive, eliminate the negative, and latch on to the affirmative. Don't mess with Mr. In Between. You got to spread